Velkommen alle sammen. The Landvættir, or land spirits in the Norse religion. Lots of people talking about these as kind of an example or connection to worship of nature, but it's actually a lot harder to determine what they are. There are very few sources on them, and the ones we have are conflicting, but in this video we're going over the actual sources so that there are no doubts about how the Norse viewed nature and their spirituality in pagan times. So a full article on this is on my website. It's actually an excerpt from a chapter in my book, just a little preview of the book there. The book is very close, guys. You've been waiting a long time. It will be ready by the end of the month, so stay tuned, but I encourage you to subscribe by email on my website to be notified, or on Instagram, because those are the more reliable ways to get notified other than being on here. So unlike the gods, Odin, Thor, Freyr, whatever, the Landvættir, they don't get a lot of flashy mentions in the myths or epic poems. In fact, they're barely mentioned at all in the big stories. Most of what we know about them comes from old laws, sagas, little bits on folklore, but even those references show just how important they were. These spirits were believed to live in the land itself, whether that be in mountains, fields, forests, waterfalls, rocks, and they were seen as protectors of the land and the people living on it. They weren't just a part of the scenery, there was an actual relationship there, a sense of mutual respect between humans and the land. First, we're gonna go over the etymology really quickly. The word itself, Landvættir, is composed of Old Norse words land, meaning land, of course, and vettir, which is roughly translated usually to mean beings or spirits. Now, vettir has a much longer linguistic history, though. It goes back through Old English, German, Dutch, and even Proto-Indo-European roots. The word vettir is derived from the Proto-West Germanic viti, which traces back to the Proto-Germanic vitis, and ultimately the Proto-Indo-European root vecti, meaning cause, sake, or thing, and it could also be related to the verb vek, meaning to say or to tell. As usual, remember that because we'll come full circle at the end of the video. But even though the word Landvættir is uniquely Norse, the belief in spirits tied to nature and place was probably much older and more widespread, something shared across ancient Germanic and Proto-Indo-European cultures. So now we're just going to go into the Norse sources because they are what displays them the best, but remember that they would have been understood of in a similar way in all Germanic and Proto-Indo-European cultures. We just don't have that many sources on them. One of the best sources we have on the Landvættir is the Landnámabók, which tells about how Iceland was settled. There are quite a few mentions of the Landvættir here, but one is called Ulfljót's Law, and that said that Viking ships had to remove their dragon head carvings before they reached the shore of Iceland. Why? So they wouldn't frighten the Landvættir when they approached. So this was not just some superstition, mind you. It might sound like that to us, but it was an actual legal and religious rule that everyone had to follow in the country. It shows how seriously people took the idea that the land was alive and that these spirits needed to be respected and treated as such. What's really interesting is that the Landvættir weren't seen as all-powerful godlike beings. They could be startled, or they could be offended, they could be frightened by something as simple as a wooden carving. So this is one little law that actually tells us a lot. It wasn't just a spiritual elite or fringe who believed in the Landvættir. It was a part of everyday life for everyone, and even if you didn't want to believe in them, you were forced to because it was a part of their culture. They wrote it in their laws. There's another story in the Landnámabók about two brothers, Ingolf and Hjörleif, who left Norway to settle in Iceland. Ingolf was the religious one. He followed the old customs, he made offerings, he honored the spirits. Hjörleif didn't. He ignored the rituals and it didn't go well for him. He ended up being betrayed and killed by one of his own slaves, and later on in the saga, Ingolf blamed it on Hjörleif's disrespect for the gods and spirits, and after that, no one would live where Hjörleif had settled in Iceland. People believed that the land there had become cursed or dangerous because the Landvættir were offended or had abandoned it because of Hjörleif's behaviors. Another great story is about a man named Björn, and it just shows the personal relationship with the Landvættir. It could be, in this tale, it was called a bergbui first, which means a rock dweller, which the land spirits were also said to live in. So Björn makes a deal with this bergbui, and not long after, one of Björn's goats suddenly becomes super fertile, and he ends up with a booming herd and plenty of wealth. Even more interesting, people who were said to have second sight, basically the gift to see into the spirit world, claimed that they saw the Landvættir followed Björn around Iceland. They even appeared with him at the Althing, so the legal assembly. So this story shows that the Landvættir weren't just tied to places like mountains or hills or rocks, things like that. They could actually bond with humans, and maybe Björn had done some things. He honored them with sacrifices or whatever. Maybe he had some kind of natural connection with them. Either way, they helped him not only with his animals and his wealth and livestock, but also with hunting and fishing, as it is said in Landnámabók. It makes you wonder, did he do certain rituals to help build these bonds, these connections with the land spirits? Were leaders or spiritually gifted people more likely to attract their favor? Also very cool in here, it shows a clear example of how we can see them. Even in the Viking Age, regular people could not see these spirits that are called Landvættir, but people with a gifted second sight could. And most of the sources on the Landvættir tell about them in Iceland, but they were absolutely elsewhere too. It was a Norwegian who brought this law about the Landvættir to Iceland. So this law was brought to Iceland about respecting the land spirits and not scaring them with the Viking ship carvings on them. But also in Egil's saga, a detailed ritual is told involving the Landvættir. Egil, after being wronged by Norwegian King Erik Bloodaxe and Queen Gunhild, Egil got his revenge by setting up a nithstang, or like a scorn pole. And this was like a magical course pole, most of you know. Egil would carve runes into it, stuck a horse's head on top and pointed it towards Norway, calling on the Landvættir to drive the king and queen out of the land. And it worked. Within a year, King Erik and Gunhild were forced to flee Norway after King Håkon took over control, and they ended up ruling in England for the rest of their lives, almost in exile. So while these stories show people trying to honor or appease the Landvættir, some of these, this one shows that they could also be weaponized. Egil didn't curse the king directly, he directed his aggression at the land spirits to do the cursing for him and remove King Erik from their lands. There's one more story that shows how people once honored the Landvættir, probably most valuable for you guys today. And this one comes from a Christian homily called Heimlising og Helgefredi, found in the Hauksbók. It tells of women bringing food to stone piles or placing it under flat rocks, offering it to the Landvættir in hopes of receiving good fortune in return. It's a Christian writer about this book, so he clearly disapproved, as you can see in the quote here, calling it superstition, but it just shows how deeply rooted and widespread this practice may have been. What's really interesting is that this wasn't just some fringe ritual practiced by a minority in the society. These stone piles and sacred spots were seen as homes for spirits and ancestors as well as the Landvættir. And the women would bless the Landvættir, as it is said in this quote here, probably speaking to them maybe, or performing some sort of small ritual or chant asking for their favor. And it might be one of the clearest examples we have of people in the old days actively worshipping or invoking the Landvættir. And really, it's that kind of practice that could easily be brought back today. It's simple and deeply connected to the land that you all can probably do anywhere near you if you believe in those sorts of things, that is. One of the most famous stories about the Landvættir, though, and the final one we'll go over, comes from Olav Tryggvason's saga. King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark wanted to invade Iceland, but before he launches an attack, he sends a wizard who shapeshifts into a whale to scout the island. And this whale wizard, as he swam around Iceland, He is blocked at every turn by the powerful Landvættir guarding over the island. They stop him at every place, forcing him to turn back with no visible way in, and they decide that Harald should not take his fleet from Denmark and attack Iceland. This is where the guardian spirits of Iceland come from today, by the way, that are still depicted on their coat of arms: a rock giant, a bird, a bull, and a dragon. And this is the origin of that. Now this is a big shift from the other sources, where the Landvættir seem to be maybe shy or easily frightened, but in Olav Tryggvason's saga, they're fierce defenders of the land, territorial spirits that protect Iceland from foreign threats with magical power. Finally, we will speak about the Landvættir after the Christianization of Scandinavia. Even after that happened, the belief in the Landvættir didn't just vanish. One great example comes from the Gulathing laws, a set of legal codes written in the 13th century Norway, quite some time after the country had officially become Christian. But as I say all the time, these things don't just happen overnight. There were still plenty of pagan beliefs and practices by the time these laws and sagas were written down. So these laws actually they prohibit the belief in spirits that lived in natural mounds, forests, or waterfalls. In other words, people were still believing and honoring the Landvættir, even though the church saw it as a threat and had to make a law about it. This wasn't just a Norse thing either. Similar bans existed all over Christianized Europe, where people still made offerings to spirits of trees, stones, and rivers, wells, springs, those types of things. So clearly those beliefs in the spirits in the land ran deep all over Europe, at least. Even centuries later, traces of the Landvættir survived in folklore. In 19th century Iceland, people still respected certain stones, and they called them landisasteinar. So landdisir, like female spirit rocks or stones, and they believed that spirits dwelled in them. And children were not allowed to play near them, and grass wasn't allowed to be cut around them. The spirits, of course, had changed names. This is almost 700-800 years after, but the reverence was the same. Across Scandinavia, too, these spirits evolved into local beings, sometimes called Vettir, sometimes Vitra, or Huldrefolk in Norway. They may not have been called Landvættir anymore, but their role stayed the same. They were spirits residing in nature, they were guardians, they were connected to specific places, and they were deeply interwoven with daily life. So even though they don't get as much spotlights as the gods, or giants, or elves, or whatever, the Landvættir are one of the clearest signs of animism in the Norse belief. They show us that the land itself was seen as alive, with spirits that could protect, punish, bless, depending on how you treated them. And this is key, as I always say. People place way too much focus in the gods in the Norse religion, when there are other spiritual entities that you may be in regular contact with on the daily, especially if you live in a more rural place. But that's, of course, if you believe in those things. So yeah, check out the article on my website or the Instagram for some quotes on these things, and the book should be ready later this month with a whole lot more about everything in the Norse religion and gods. But that's all for today. Vi ses nästa gång.